Hello, and today we're going to be looking at are the trade routes between 800 and 1400, primarily in Eurasia. And this is going to take care of topics 2.1, 2.3, 2.4. So we're going to be able to take three different topics from the AP curriculum and mash them together and get through them very quickly. Because a lot of what I'm about to mention has already been touched on in previous lectures. So this is a great spot in world history, is that now we're starting to build on things that the foundation that we've laid throughout Unit 1. So the first thing we're going to look at is a basic review. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these four different trade networks. You have the Indian Ocean trade, which is labeled on this map in black lines. And the Indian Ocean trade deals with East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Middle East, East Africa, and Swahili states. So this connects several regions together in one common trade network. The Silk Roads are going to connect East Asia, Central Asia, and to the Middle East. The Indian Ocean trade is a water-based trade, whereas the Silk Roads, which isn't just one road, but a series of roads, is a land-based trade system. The Trans-Saharan trade system, which is also land-based, incorporates North Africa, West Africa, and the Middle East. So it connects the Mediterranean world to sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East to sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see the Trans-Saharan network outlined in red. And then for our last one is the Mediterranean trade, which is outlined in green. And the Mediterranean trade is going to connect West Europe to North Africa and to the Middle East. These four trade networks are going to connect most of Eurasia together in a form of trade. So it's not necessarily that people will travel from one spot of the trade network to the other. What happens is that there's a series of exchanges going along these routes, and that's where you get your trade and growth developing. So we're going to talk about some big themes. Instead of looking at little details, we're going to kind of take big themes. And if you remember the big themes, you're going to be in very good shape for this part of the lecture, or this part of the course. The first thing is that trade expanded due to technology. So the idea is that these trade networks are growing in activity between 800 and 1400. They had always been around since about 200, 100 CE. But between 100 and about 6 to 700, the activity along these trade routes declined. In about 800, the trade starts to pick back up. And part of the reason for that resurgence of trade is because of technology. For example, in the Indian Ocean, there are several water-based technologies, sailing technologies that are developed. And we call these maritime technologies or maritime innovations. The Chinese, for example, developed what's called a stern post rudder that allows somebody to steer a ship much more easily in the open seas. The magnetic compass, which is critical to navigating in the open seas, develops as well. And now there's a way of not relying, if you will, on just sheer knowledge of the stars. Muslim merchants who dominated the Indian Ocean trade network from 800 on also bring in the astrolabe, which is a technology that allows you to measure where the stars are at a particular time of the year. And if you think about what we talked about with Islam and their innovations within astronomy, it's no surprise that they would apply that knowledge of astronomy to help navigate much better on the open seas. And also the lateen sails, which are credit to the Muslim merchants, but may have come before them. The lateen sails are also what we call triangular sails. And what these sails allow you to do is capture the wind from multiple directions. And in a sense, you can sail against the wind or against the headwind. So what's happening is that the ships are becoming easier to navigate. They're also becoming more sturdy on the open seas, which means when you have a better piece of transportation, you can engage in more trade. When we go to the Trans-Saharan trade network, as well as the Silk Road, one of the big innovations is saddles for camels. And what happens is that camels are these beasts of burden that are critical to trade in that area. They can carry approximately 600 pounds, What the saddle development does, or the saddle technology does, is it allows that weight to be evenly distributed on the camel. So the camel doesn't tire out as quickly and can take more of a heavy load. The concept of a caravan, where people are traveling together, that there's security in numbers, is also an innovation that helps trade to expand. So when we look at things like this, it's not unfamiliar to us. So when we think about, the innovations we've created, such as 16-wheel trucks and cargo planes, that has allowed for an increase in trade that wasn't there before those technologies came about. And trade goes faster, trade gets cheaper. And when that happens, trade grows. So the next major theme we want to talk about is trade expanding because of political stability. For example, the Silk Road grows in terms of activity because the Mongols make it safe to travel along the Silk Road. The Mongols provide the protection to make sure that the Silk Road is a safe trade network. In the Trans-Saharan trade network, it's the Mali Empire that provides stability and provides order through this network of trade. For the Indian Ocean, it's the religion of Islam that creates that security and order. Because when you think about the Indian Ocean, you think about how I mentioned so many different regions, what pulled a lot of those merchants together, whether they be from the Swahili city-states or from the coast along the Indian Ocean, along South Asia, or they be out in Srivijaya in Southeast Asia, what pulled them together for the most part was their common Islamic belief. And even though you had a diverse population, having that single religion, for the most part, for most of these merchants, created a sense of unity that allowed them to engage in peaceful trade. And then lastly, in the Mediterranean Sea, the decline of Viking raids in about 900 CE is going to spark the growth of trade within the Mediterranean Ocean, or the Mediterranean Sea. So when you look at all four of these things, trade becomes safer, trade becomes less of a risk, which means more people are willing to take the risk. More people are willing to engage in the trade because they're more confident that the trade can be carried out safely. So that's where political stability plays a big role. The other thing to note is that the Mongols, the Mali, Islam, the merchant community of Europe encouraged trade. They supported and encouraged trade as well. So in the case of the Mongols, the encouragement of trade was critical to the expansion of trade. So you can't separate the political from the economic. They are one and the same, or they're interlinked with one another. The third statement that we can make is that trade led to growth of cities and states. So the basic premise is simple. There's really two. Cities grow when trade intersects. So if you think of Damascus once again, and you think of Route 108 intersecting with Route 27, is it a big surprise that here's these two rows of trade, a town will develop at the intersection? And when you think of most towns in Montgomery County, most of them, the old town, the original part of town, all begin at an intersection of roads. Where I grew up in Olney, it was Route 97 and Route 108. And that's where Olney began. And then Olney spread out from there. So as we have more and more traffic going through that area, the cities are going to grow. And that's what you've had all throughout history. New York City is basically just an intersection of trade. Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, San Diego, San Francisco, Chicago, St. Louis. These are all major crossroads of trade that allow a city to grow. Frederick is a crossroads of trade. So we get that concept where cities grow because trade intersects. And then we get the state growth. And I'm not going to go back through the state growth because we talked about it so much already. But basically, because the states tax the trade going through their borders, the states can increase their revenue and grow as a result. The Srivijaya, the Mali Empire are two primary examples that I would point to. So when we look along the Silk Road, there's going to be three kinds of cities that I want you to pay attention to. Two are cities. So Samarkand is a city that kind of is halfway between China and the Middle East and represents a middle point. And today, I believe it's in the present day of Uzbekistan. The Mongols eventually are going to conquer this city, but it becomes a center of trade because it's the midpoint through the Silk Road. So it becomes an important area of commerce, trade. Craftspeople are going to settle there to sell their goods. Merchants are going to interact there. And Samarkand is going to develop as a significant city of trade along the Silk Road. Also, Kashgar is going to develop as a city of trade. Kashgar is going to be located, I'm looking at the map right now. Kashgar is going to be located in China, kind of on the western part of China, and it's going to represent kind of when you're starting to enter into China. And as I look at the map, I'm seeing that it's not there. But Kashgar is going to be an example of that, that in a sense, after all this traveling along the Silk Road, Kashgar is going to be that first city that you come into when you arrive in China. And then lastly, we have this idea of the caravanserai. Caravanserai, I can say that with confidence. The caravanserai are not so much cities as they are small rest stops along the Silk Road. The caravanserai has been around, that concept has been around since the ancient Persians, back in about 600 BCE. But what the Mongols do is they sponsor the buildings of these caravanserais, which are resting stops for the caravans traveling along the Silk Road. And these rest stops are spaced out roughly every 100 miles, which is about the distance a camel can cover without stopping for water. So you get this idea that they may not be huge cities, but they end up as trading posts. They end up as trading towns. People settle around there so that they can do business with the merchants coming in and out. And the caravanserai is not too different than the various rest stops that you see up and down I-95, where there is kind of this spot where you can pull over. And that's not so much for people taking their family trips. It's really for the truckers. And it allows the truckers someplace to stop so that they can sleep, they can refuel, they can get food, and they can move along. And that speeds up the process of trade. In the trans-Saharan trade, Timbuktu is the primary example that I would point you to. Timbuktu becomes a center of not just trade, but also of education, culture, religious studies. That's what we primarily see going on in Timbuktu. For the Indian Ocean, you get coastal cities. For example, one of the Swahili city-states, Mombasa, would be a great example of a city that grows because of the Indian Ocean trade network. Muscat, which is up, if you look at the Arabian Peninsula on the eastern coast, Muscat becomes a major city as it's a port of trade that connects the Middle East to India. And then lastly, along the Indian coast, you get Calicut. So you can take a look at this map and see a variety of cities that pop up along these trade routes. And with the Mediterranean, the city I want you to know is Venice. Now, some cities like Alexandria, Damascus, Baghdad, Constantinople, those cities had been long time established. Mecca, I also see on Saudi Arabia, Delhi. These cities have been long established, but they also grow and benefit from the introduction of trade and the growth of trade during this time. The next major thing, our fourth major concept, is that trade relied on knowledge of nature. Human beings are really good at figuring out how nature works. We figure out how tides come in and out. We've gotten to the point where we can predict to the minute when the oceans reach high tide and when the oceans reach low tide. This ability to predict the natural world is critical. And back a long time ago, human beings understood how wind patterns worked. So the Indian Ocean, there is a predictable pattern of monsoon winds where they change directions throughout the year at the same time. So you can accurately predict when the wind is going to change and how that's going to influence trade and movement across the Indian Ocean. So you pick windows to leave. For example, if you're leaving the Swahili city-states and going to the tip of South Asia, there's a time of the year where you know the winds will cooperate. And there's a time when you know it won't. And when the winds change, you're usually coming back. So that knowledge of the monsoon winds, that's something you should start because it is a critical way of understanding how the Indian Ocean develops. And the thing is, human beings understood these monsoon winds back to the Roman Empire. But with their advanced technology of sailing, trips were becoming much shorter because the transportation was just that much better. And then along the Silk Road and the Trans-Saharan routes, the location of oases, these spots where there was watering holes, if you will. So in the middle of a desert, there are areas of fresh water where there will be vegetation and there will be an ability to support human settlements. And those oases were known to travel guides. Knowing where they were was critical to maintaining trade. In the Silk Road has deserts that they have to traverse, but there are rivers that occasionally come across the Silk Roads. Cities that develop along these rivers basically act as a Silk Road version of the oasis. And that's where these cities and towns are going to develop that act as stopping points for caravans along their trade routes. So in both cases, knowledge of how nature works is critical to supporting trade. Next, trade leads to financial innovation. So as trade grows, the way we do business grows as well. Because as you have more interaction, you get more complexity. And if you think about it for a second, carrying copper coins all over the place, especially as trade grows, just becomes impractical. So, we don't walk around with tons of cash in our wallets like we used to. Actually, let me back up. Let me just give you a real world example. When I was a young man, not a young man, when I was a young boy, every Monday I remember going to the bank with my mom. My mom would go into the bank, she would withdraw the cash for the week. So her Monday errand, I was like 4, I can remember this distinctly. I would go with my mom, she would go into the bank, I would get a lollipop, she would withdraw money from the bank, and that was the cash that we were going to have for the rest of the week. She would go to the teller, make a withdrawal, end of story. And everybody was doing that, so you can imagine the lines. You don't go to the bank every day because the bank had tremendous lines. You do it once a week, you pull out the cash you need, and that's the end of it. That's how it worked in the 1970s and into the 1980s. And then we got an innovation called the ATM. And now, instead of going into the bank, you could go to these machines and pull out cash at any hour. Now cash was easily accessible. And that innovation changed the economy. One economist said it was the greatest invention to impact the economy that the United States had ever seen, because now people could instantly access cash. But then think about today, the innovation. Now we have Venmo. Now we have Apple Pay. We have all of this stuff can happen through our phones. And we're starting to transition away from cash into a cashless economy that's a digital economy. That is going to encourage and increase trade even more. So we are just witnessing innovations that have been going on, and we're just part of those changes. Back in the 1200s, or actually even before that, we credit China for a lot of these innovations. China originates the paper money concept. The idea that a piece of paper had value backed up by precious metals. So if you walked in and you turned in your piece of paper, you could collect the value of that in coinage. We had that concept in the United States until we left the gold standard, where if you turned in a dollar bill, you could get the value of that dollar bill in gold, on demand. Carrying gold is difficult. Walking around with paper money is much easier. But the thing with paper money is that walking around with a lot of it and doing business all over the place, because there isn't just one single currency, is complicated. So what happens is that the Chinese developed what's called flying cash. So a merchant would deposit his paper money into one house and he would keep a record. And then if he went to another house, he could borrow against that amount of money that he had. And that's what we call credit. So the concept of credit, the idea that I'm borrowing money against the balance of my account, and that another bank goes, okay, I see that you have $800. Here, we'll give you 50 and we'll pull that 50 out another time. That concept allows for more economic interaction, and it also represents financial cooperation across the trade regions, which encourages trade. And in order to keep these records, keep track of the money, special houses are going to develop. Now, initially, some of these houses are located in Buddhist temples along the Silk Road. But over time, independent houses that are strictly dedicated to this financial record keeping and these financial transactions become known as banking houses. And of course, this is the forerunner to the modern bank. Gradually, that innovation makes its way out to Europe. Banks are going to start popping up, lending out money to merchants to allow them to engage in more trade. And with the development of credit and the ability to kind of trade throughout a larger region with currency is going to help spark the growth of trade. And then the Bill of Exchange. What the Bill of Exchange basically says is it's almost like a charge from one merchant to another, where the merchant promises to pay, and the Bill of Exchange is enforced by the government. So when you've got the Mongols running the Silk Road, any financial transaction is going to be enforced by the Mongol Empire. And that's one of the things that a lot of people forget, that in order for me to do business with other people, I need to have faith that this business is going to be honest and that what I pay for is what I get. Think about it for a second. You go to Amazon, you order something, you are trusting that that product is going to be sent to you. And you trust that it's going to be what you want. And trust only goes so far. You need the power of the government to back this up. The Mongols backed it up in a very particular way. They did it with force. Today, we have contract law, we have consumer rights, we have these variety of laws and rights and protections to guarantee that the business we engage in with one another is on the up and up. And that brings me to Europe, one more innovation. What happens, if you take a look at the map, you'll see a lot of red dots, particularly in the north. Those are different towns. There's approximately, I think there's like 30 to 40 of these towns. And what these towns do is they pull together as a trading coalition. In other words, they tie their economic interests in with one another. They give each other access to their ports. They provide a way of getting goods out to one another. And this cooperation of towns we call the Hanseatic League. And what the merchants of the Hanseatic League do is they leave the northern part of Europe, come around Spain into the Mediterranean Ocean to access goods that have come from the east. And then they go back out and they spread those goods throughout Northern Europe. So the Hanseatic League represents a innovation because it represents an economic cooperation of different towns where they support one another, they provide ports to one another, and the general idea is that economic activity can broaden. Now, I believe there's three more themes that I just want to talk about with trade. One is that trade was driven by demand for luxury items. Trade at this point is very expensive. To travel the Silk Road is an expensive endeavor. To travel the Trans-Saharan Trade Network is an expensive, hazardous situation. To have ships to go on the Mediterranean or on the Indian Ocean is an expensive proposition. So merchants aren't going for the common man. Merchants are going for the upper class and for the wealthier segments of society. And the wealthier segments of society are not so concerned with the basic needs because they have that covered. They're looking for luxury items. Think about the very name Silk Road. It's silk. That was one of the primary products being traded across there. We see ivory being traded. We see slaves being traded. The idea of slaves being traded was really geared towards the upper class of society because they were the only ones who could afford slaves. So you have this idea that this wealth of the upper class drives the development of these four different networks. Trade also leads to what we call diasporic merchant communities. So that's a word you're going to want to underline, diasporic. And the word that I like to associate with diasporic is dispersion, spreading out. So the definition of a diasporic merchant community is a community of merchants that have left their homeland to go to another region in order to do business. In other words, they're moving closer to work. So if we think of Muslim merchants who originate in the Middle East, but settle around the coastal towns of South Asia or settle into China. China would be one great example. And they live a lot of their lives working in China. They're far away from home. They usually speak a different language, they practice different customs, but they come to know the Chinese custom. And that's the primary example. There's plenty of Muslim diasporic communities. The Jews coming into the Mediterranean is another example of a diasporic merchant community. So what you have these, you have Chinese merchants throughout Southeast Asia. You have these merchants living outside their homeland. And the big thing that you want to understand about the diasporic merchant community is that they maintain their cultural practices. But their cultural practices also start to blend in with the culture that they're living with. So, for example, religion would be a great example of how culture spreads. But if we think about music and how music spreads and influences other cultures, if you think about how diasporic communities will adopt local customs as well, they don't necessarily, just isolate themselves. For example, Muslims living in China are going to build mosques that are Chinese in architectural design, but still serve an Islamic purpose. And then our last thing is that trade facilitated cultural, technological, and biological diffusion. These trade networks don't just transport goods, they also transport ideas, technologies, viruses, cultural practices such as food preparation, music, musical instruments, games, all of these things spread. One such example, and I'll end with this, are playing cards. Playing cards most likely originated out of China, made its way through the Middle East and up into Europe, and it evolved into the playing cards that we know today. It took hundreds, if not 1,000 years for this to develop. Actually, no, hundreds of years. But if you follow where playing cards were in the world, you're following these trade networks. So the good thing about all this diffusion is that that's the next topic that I'll be lecturing on. In the meantime, this wraps up our trade networks. And if you notice it's been a little bit briefer, that's because we've laid a lot of groundwork already with the first year. So as always, come to class with questions and anything that you need clarification on. And I will see you at the next lecture. Bye.